I can see you, but I can think of you anyway. I'm just waiting for a few minutes because I noticed on the screen, as well as being a bit personally, I'm feeling as if things are improving, and that I gather that in Winchester Cathedral they held a live evensong for the first time in 6 months, so that's really encouraging. They obviously found a way to get around the regulations, and everybody's very frightened of this SIX business. I think we need to remember that applies primarily to social events, social occasions. It doesn't apply, obviously, in educational facilities, and it certainly doesn't apply in. It seems fairly clear that we can get some action going. It's very poor, so I'm just going to try and see if I can do something about that. So bear with me a moment. It may be other members of the choir using other members of the family using too much Wi-Fi. Hang on a minute. Thank you. Sorry about that. Apparently the Wi-Fi's been really iffy today. I haven't been here, but apparently it's not been good all day. So I just hope that we can carry on and that it'll last us out. So before I went away, I was just saying that that there have been some quite encouraging signs of things getting better. One is the evensong at Winchester Cathedral today, which is great. The company that I work for, Grange Park Opera, they put on an opera over the weekend with a live audience. Obviously, it was socially distanced, and they had this crazy idea, typical WASFI, of to make up for the empty seats. They encouraged the members of the audience to bring teddy bears. And so you would have people sitting on seats, and the empty seats were occupied by these big bears and teddy bears and so forth, which is a typical WASFI idea, but really quite a nice idea because it meant that looking out over the auditorium, it looked full rather than having isolated little groups of people. So that was good. The only downside of that was, of course, it's never going to work financially. And in fact, they didn't even charge for it. It was free tickets to friends of the company and benefactors and so on. So there's no way that anybody can do it realistically in a commercial way under those circumstances. But at least it was happening, and at least it did happen, and people were singing live, working together, I think with a piano, but they were working together and rehearsing together, and that's really good, very encouraging, I think. And the other thing I was going to pass on to you was that I had a delightful conversation with the wonderful Erica Eloff on Saturday. You remember the soprano Erica Eloff, who's sung for us on many occasions, just a glorious singer and a wonderful person as well. She was telling me that she has now moved from the UK. She has a 2-year contract at Linz in Austria, So she's working for the opera company in Linz, doing all the major soprano roles. And the good news from her was that they are due to open when Beethoven's Fidelio. She's singing the role of Leonora, of course, but they are due to open this coming Saturday. And whilst they're being very careful and there's lots of mask wearing and all the rest of it, but the company is functioning, the orchestra are rehearsing, the orchestra are performing, the chorus are working, all the singers are able to rehearse on stage in a comparatively normal way. And they've also, I don't know how they've managed this, but they're getting 60% houses as the maximum into the opera house, which is incredible. And it's still not as good as obviously 100%, but it's a lot higher than anything I've seen in this country. So if they can do it in Austria, let's hope, fingers crossed, that it all works okay. And it will be great if people like that, and Grange Park and so forth, if they can really show the light, show the way forward, so that the rest of us can follow in a safe and secure way. And hopefully, who knows, we can get back sooner rather than later. I do hope so. Now, for tonight's topic, I can probably start the proper topic now, as it's nearly 22 to 7:40. No apologies really, but I decided to go back to Bach, would you believe? And there are two reasons for this. One is because it's Bach, and it is a glorious subject to talk about. But equally importantly, although I did mention obviously the concert that we did on the 14th of March back in those days, I did mention it and I did talk about it a little bit. Of course, what's happened is, because we've had 6 months of no performances, no live rehearsals, very little live music making, that event, that 14th of March event, has become more and more important to me personally as the days and the weeks and the months have gone on. We knew at the time, didn't we, that it was quite a special event, and it was quite an amazing occasion, for all sorts of reasons, but particularly because we all knew that this was going to be the last performance before some sort of lockdown was going to take place. Didn't know how long it would be, probably didn't think it was going to be as long as this, but nevertheless, we knew at the time it was quite a significant moment. And that significance has just grown and grown in my own thoughts ever since. And I just thought, well, I'd like to talk a little bit about the piece itself and why it's so special. And in particular, this is the kind of thing that perhaps we ought to do before we do a concert. But of course, we always seem to be so busy and tied up with rehearsing and learning all the notes and doing all the things that we took for granted in those days. So at least we now know something of the piece. We performed it. We have a familiarization with this great work. So I just thought it would be perhaps useful just to go back and look at it again, in the light of its historical significance and so forth. To try and put that memory of the 14th of March in Winchester Cathedral into a context. So this extraordinary work, the B minor Mass in B minor, or Mass in H Moll, as it's also called, which we'll come on to later. One of the things about this piece, which I think you cannot deny, or one cannot deny, is that there are many people who consider it to be one of the greatest achievements of Western culture. So we're talking not just about a great piece of music, but an extraordinary claim to make about anything. But it's one that people repeatedly, greater minds than mine, obviously, have often repeatedly claimed for this piece. Speaking personally, I only feel qualified to talk about musical achievements, and I would certainly place it very, very high up in my own list of all-time greats, if you see what I mean. And certainly in terms of choral works, it would be very clearly in my top 3 I would say. The other two would probably be Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, and the Verdi Requiem would be, together with the B minor Mass, they would be my top three. Several others fighting to get in there. Belshazzar's Feast, Dream of Gerontius, all kinds of other things, Mozart's C minor Mass, loads of stuff pushing to get into that list. But if I had to put top three down, they will be it. Now, what is so special about this work? Well, first of all, it's worth remembering that it was written, or at least completed, it came to life, if you like, in 1749, of Last Offering. It's the pinnacle of everything that he achieved within his life and within his compositional career. So that in itself is significant. Secondly, and this is one of the things that is well known but often forgotten, that it was almost certainly never performed in Bach's own lifetime. And it's almost as if the composer knew it was never going to be performed in his own lifetime. It was kind of too big, too complex, too demanding, too impractical. Everything about it was just too difficult, really. And it was almost inevitable that there wouldn't be an actual performance of this piece from beginning to end in his lifetime. And in fact, it wasn't till 110 years later, in 1859, that the first performance of this piece took place, which is astonishing. When you remember that music in the Baroque period, and indeed in most musical periods before the 20th century, music was always contemporary. If you went to a concert, or you went to hear a choir sing in a church or cathedral or whatever, they would nearly always be performing music that was contemporary. That, in other words, it was written at the time or just prior to that time. The idea of writing something, or rather performing something that had been written 200 years ago, was just unthinkable. Everything was new, it was fresh, it was the style of the day, the style of the moment. A bit like architecture. I mean, you know, on the whole, architects and creators of beautiful buildings in the Baroque period, they stuck to the contemporary style, and all the buildings of a particular period tend to share the style that was going around at that time, rather than trying to reflect previous generations of architecture. So to have a piece of this quality that would normally be enthusiastically received by contemporary audiences, to have it sitting for 110 years unheard is just extraordinary. But there are reasons for that. Inevitably, Bach, being the pragmatist that he was, he knew that a piece of this scale was just too big to fit into the Lutheran style of worship. As you know, he was employed at St. Thomas's Leipzig in the latter part of his life, and his job was to provide, not only be in control of the music on a daily basis, but also to write music specifically for festivals and for special events, and indeed every Sunday. So it was very much intended that the music that he wrote should fit into the liturgy of the Lutheran Church of the time. And being a non-Catholic branch of Christianity, the idea of very, very large-scale celebratory masses was not something that they would normally consider. And in fact, the Lutheran Mass would only have consisted of a Kyrie and a Gloria. And Bach indeed wrote several versions of a Lutheran Mass, which just have those two movements and doesn't have a Credo or Sanctus, Benedictus Agnus Dei, all the other parts of the ordinary of the Mass that we're used to hearing. So just on that scale alone, this piece was extraordinary. It's known as a High Mass, or the Great Catholic Mass, also known as the Missa Tota, the sort of total Mass. So that in itself was impractical for a Lutheran setting. And you're aware, having performed it, of just what a big scale piece it is. Apart from anything else, it lasts 2 hours now, or more, roughly, I would say, around 2 hours. Very few pieces, if any, that have been written by 1749 lasted anything like that amount of time, apart from story and narrative, recitative, which binds it all together and brings the narrative forward. The thing about that, though, is that it's not as musically complex to write recitative, which is basically glorified speech, as it is to write a big movement of a setting of a mass for 5-part choir or 6-part choir and large orchestra and so on. So just in terms of its compositional scale, a 2-hour work in 1749 was exceptional. Nobody had attempted to write a piece on this scale before. And it would be a long time before they did again after this event. The orchestra is quite interesting and quite large. As you know, it has 2 flutes, 2 oboes who double on oboe d'amore, has 2 bassoons, rather unusually, has a solo natural horn. It only appears in 1 movement, but it's a pretty crucial instrument when it's there. Then, of course, there are the 3 trumpets, the timpani, full body of strings, and all the continuo instruments, organ, harpsichord, lute, etc. So a big combination of instruments. And of course, the chorus itself is big. As you know, it's in some cases, it's double choir, full double choir, 2 lots of SATB, 8 parts, all big scale. In addition, you have to have at least 5 soloists to perform this piece, as we know. So, you know, it is a big scale piece. And one of the things that people often are not as much scathing, but at least making others aware, is of course that some of this work wasn't written originally for this particular piece. In other words, what Bach did, again being a very pragmatic composer, one of the things he did was to use material that he'd used before, rehashing things, rewriting things, sometimes just borrowing whole sections, whole movements that had been used in previous works or had been used in cantatas and so on. But I have to say, I personally see nothing wrong in that at all. If I'd written music of this standard and this scale, and there was a piece that I used 5 years ago, which had been performed once, and I rather quite liked it, thought it was okay, I think the idea of bringing it into this work as a kind of greatest hits kind of compilation, not a bad idea, and I certainly wouldn't be critical of him doing that. In nearly every case, it's not just a complete lift, it's nearly always enhanced or enlarged or reorchestrated or extended or something. But there are examples of material, one has to admit, that have been used before. But there are also movements that were written specifically. The wonderful Et Incarnatus, that is a good example of a movement that was written specifically for this massive work that we're talking about here. And when the piece appeared, when it was all put together, it appeared in 4 big sections. So you had the Lutheran Mass sections, the Kyrie and the Gloria, as it were, part 1. And then you had the second section, which would include what we would think of as the Credo, the Creed. And that was known as the Symbolum Nicaeum. And that was another big section. And then the third section is the Sanctus, the massive Sanctus with the 8-part choirs and the trumpets and all the rest of it. And then the final part contains the Hosannas, the Benedictus, and the Agnus Dei, the 4th, as it were, section, major section of this piece. But the significance of B minor is, I think, interesting. I've talked many times before about this concept of B natural. I happen to have a piano here, so when we play that B natural, we think okay, that's fine. It's a nice note, and it works very well as the leading note in C major. So if we've got a scale of C major, it's a very convenient leading note. It leads us back into the tonic at the end of the scale, and as such works brilliantly. It also works very well in the dominant chord of C major. We need the B natural to provide the major and the major interval in the triad of G major, which is the dominant of C. So B natural is a very useful note in many ways. However, musicians living in the 17th century in particular, and even into the beginning of the 18th century, found the concept of B problematic. Why? Because if you go from C up a perfect fourth to an F, we have a perfect interval, a perfect fourth. If we go up a fourth from F, we then get to the self-same B natural, and this triad, or the diabolus in musicum, as it's also called, augmented fourth. They found that problematic because it's a harsh dissonance and it just doesn't make any kind of consonant sense to musicians of that period. And so one of the things that tended to happen was, in certain contexts, rather than having F to B natural, what they would do is simply say, okay, flat. And there was a time when if you saw the note B or heard or a reference to the note B, what they actually meant was B flat. So in certain contexts, it would automatically be flattened, that note B. That left our old friend B natural left out on a limb, pushed out, nobody wanted him. And the response to that was, okay, we need to use another letter from the alphabet in order to indicate when we really do mean B natural and not B flat. And as we've used already A to G to name the letters of the notes, then the obvious letter to use for that B natural was H. So on the title of this piece, Mass in B minor, it's often written as Mess in H Moll, with the B natural being replaced by the letter H, and that's why. And the other thing that's significant about that, of course, is that many composers of the time and just prior to Bach's mature years would have thought it would be quite impossible to write anything in B minor. As I think I've explained on many times before, and I don't want to bore you with this, but just to refer very quickly, the natural notes of the harmonic series are a physical phenomenon. The octaves, the fifths, the perfect fourth, the major thirds, the minor third, and the whole tones at the top, all of those are natural notes within the harmonic series. They are physical laws that exist, whether we like it or not. And that's what underpins the difference between a consonance, what we think of as a major chord, and some kind of dissonance, where there isn't that natural order of the intervals and of the harmonies. Now, when composers were writing, and indeed musicians were performing in these keys, these natural keys, they tended to refine the tuning so that it was as accurate as possible, which meant you had really nice, bright major thirds, very bright, sharp intervals, which work beautifully. It's known as just intonation, and it works beautifully for playing in individual keys. But the problem with it was, with just intonation, is that by the time you get away from the simpler keys, the C's, the F's, the G's, the D's, and so on, once you get to keys like B major or B minor or F sharp major, then it became excruciating to listen to, because by then all this just intonation just didn't work to play for these more strange keys. And that's why Bach decided that the thing to do, just to prove that it could be done, if you average out all the notes so that every semitone is equal, then you have what's known as the well-tempered system, where every note is the same, and you can then play equally happily in any key. Now, when we're singing, if you're listening to really fine singing group, I don't know, Voces 8 or 16 or whatever it is, you will find that part of the attractive quality of their singing is the fact that they do tend to use very, very accurate intonation. So they use a kind of just intonation, which makes these beautifully rounded, singing, bell-like qualities to the harmonies. And of course, you can do that because you can always adapt with the human voice. String players can do the same thing. But if you're a wind player or brass player or a keyboard player, then you have to use the well-tempered system where everything is averaged out. So to pick a key to write this was difficult for the composer as you can possibly imagine. And you can imagine that many of his contemporaries would have looked at him thinking, are you completely mad? You can't possibly write a mass in B minor. Nobody else had ever attempted it. And actually, interestingly, there are 27 movements altogether in this work, but only 5 of them are actually in B minor. Part of the reason for that is that the trumpets of that period were pitched in D, which of course is the relative major of B minor. So there are 12 movements out of the 27 in D, which has the great advantage of allowing the trumpets to play. So all the Sanctus, Gloria, all of those movements are in D rather than B minor. And indeed, interestingly also, the first three movements, the Kyrie, the Christe eleison, and the second Kyrie, go in terms of their key centers from B to D and then to F sharp minor. So if you put the 3 notes together, B, D natural, and F sharp, of course, there you have a triad of B minor. So not only is the whole piece starting in B minor, but it also, the first 3 key centers form a triad of B minor, just to enhance that. So what do we got? What have we got with this piece? And that's the question I want to try and finish with some thoughts about. One of the things that makes it, to me, so extraordinary and glorious to take part in is its sheer adaptability. As you know, we did it with recorded it with 1 voice, 1 singer per part, which is an extraordinary hard thing to do, bearing in mind they've got to sing all the solo parts as well as all the chorus parts. It must be absolutely terrifying concept where your sole responsibility for every single note of the tenor part or the second bass or whatever it is. But it works, and that's the thing about this piece. It's so adaptable. It works. Every style of music that had been created up until this point of the mid-18th century is represented here. Of course, we've got fugues. Of course, we have arias. Of course, we have ritornelli. We have very elaborate orchestral sections, sinfonias. We have chamber music examples. We have madrigals. We have plain song being used. We have every style of music known to mankind at that point being utilized in this piece and being stretched to somewhere where these styles had never really been before. And that's one of the reasons why I feel myself that it is as if Bach knew he was writing for posterity. It wasn't just something that was going to be done next week or next year or whatever. This is something that he was laying out for humanity as a whole to have access to enjoy, to revel in for literally centuries to come, which of course is what's happened. And I think it's also important from my point of view to recognize that it's not as if this is just a liturgical piece or even a piece for Christians. Of course, it is a wonderfully religious piece, and Bach himself was a very, very a profound Christian and a great believer, he couldn't have done it without being so. But for people who aren't particularly religious, they still manage to get a huge amount out of this piece because of its sheer scale, its size, and its kind of celebratory aspect. It's a bit like walking into a cathedral. If you walk into your favorite cathedral, it's a very spiritual place, and you may well feel that spirituality, but you're also very aware of the sheer glory of the construction, of the creation of this magnificent building. You think about those who created it, designed it, built it, and many people probably died building it. I mean, the whole process of creating a building of the scale of Winchester Cathedral or Salisbury or Milan or wherever, St. Peter's, Rome. I mean, all these buildings, they have an intense meaning and significance to us as human beings, way beyond and including any kind of religious aspect. So that certainly applies to this piece. And I think also one of the things which certainly comes across very, very clearly to me is when I think of Bach as a human being. Here is a man who by this stage was almost entirely blind. He would have spent a huge amount of his time working with very bad light, probably a single candle, not only writing music, writing out every single note on with a scratchy quill pen onto a piece of paper, but also having to write out all the parts, copy all the parts, organize rehearsals. I mean, the sheer pragmatism of this man is extraordinary. At the same time, he needed to have a huge amount of vision and imagination and creativity. So all the cognitive aspects of human being, we need to have that, of course. And there's no greater brain, there's no greater mind who's ever put pen to paper to create music than Johann Sebastian Bach. But the third element, which I think is so important, is the sheer craftsmanship. If we think of human beings as being, head, heart, and hand, then we tend to overlook the hand, and we tend to underestimate the importance of the sheer craftsmanship of doing what he does, writing it out, the skills, the labor, all of those aspects, all for a project for which there was no apparent purpose other than posterity. And that's one of the things that I just find absolutely extraordinary about this piece, and why it inspires me every day. And the more I think about it, and the further we get away from that last performance in March, the more important it becomes all the time. And that is just amazing for me. One other thing before I stop that I just wanted to mention, is in particular 1960s, 1970s, the whole classical music performance ideal towards authenticity. So people talked about we went about creating these modern performances of a piece that was maybe 200 or 300 years old. And the idea was to literally try and recreate what we thought a contemporary audience of Bach or Handel's would have heard at the time. Great idea, fantastic idea, and it certainly had a very marked effect on how pieces were performed. But of course, there was always a fundamental flaw. We heard Beethoven and Wagner and Strauss and Schoenberg and everything you can possibly think of in the 20th century, including world music, jazz, blues, rock, popular music of every description. So in other words, we have changed fundamentally as listeners from a listener working or sitting listening in the middle of the 18th century. So the idea that we could recreate that experience was never really going to be true. We could try, but it's never to the year now. But at the same time, it's taking into consideration all the things that we have learned. And do we have who wrote about music at that time? We can also get ideas from those instruments that have survived, or years, violins in particular. Many of those have survived. Some of the wind instruments, some of the brass instruments, and particularly the organs in some of the churches have survived. So we get to know a little bit about the pitch. We get to know about how the instruments of that time worked and so on. And we can take all this into consideration in the way in which we interpret music. But it has to be an interpretation that is fitting for now, not trying to look backwards and just try and recreate as some kind of museum piece. And I think working with the Hanover Band, who have exactly this idea as their principle of how they work, they're not trying to be authentic, but they are trying to play in a way which is at least historically informed and makes some kind of sense to not only a composer of Bach's period, but would also make sense to a listener today. And so hip is something that we'll be finding a lot more about in future concerts and for future projects that we do. But I think it's really good that we have that theory at the back of our mind. So we're not trying to simply recreate the past. We're doing something which is new, different, of today, relevant for today, relevant for modern audience, but also historically informed. And that's what I hope we achieved on that famous day, on the 14th of March. I've talked quite enough tonight, and I can only thank you for your patience. And if you're still there, it's difficult to tell sometimes, but I'm sure you are, some of you. So many thanks for listening, and I shall look forward to speaking to you again shortly, next week maybe. Bye for now.